Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure when you get invited to speak at a conference which is outside your zone of expertise, if you will. You always wonder if there's any value added that you can give, so I very much hope that there is a few points that may be useful. What I'm going to do in the time allowed me is to concentrate, first part, on the growth of the Precariat and what it means, and the second part, if I have time, on basic income, in particular drawing on some pilots that we've conducted covering thousands of people where we provided them with a basic income and monitored the effects. Now, what I want to do is start with a couple of contextual remarks. Every age throughout history has had its stupidity about what is work and what is not work. My contention in the Precariat is that our age is the most stupid of all. And if you go back to the ancient Greeks, although they had a hierarchical, sexist, slave-based society, their conceptualization of time is something that artists and social scientists should resurrect and treat with far more respect than is the case. For the ancient Greeks, labor for exchange value was done by the slaves, the banosoi, the metics, the outsiders, the non-citizens. Work was different. Work was done with your friends and your families around the home, praxis. It was to reproduce your capabilities, reproduce your social aspects, and in a sense, develop yourself as a personality in philia, in civic friendship. Alongside, the Greeks saw a role for play, for recuperation, and, most important of all, for a citizen, the fourth, which we call leisure, skole, or schole, was about learning and participating in the life of the polis, in the agora. And the essence of that distinction was that the idea of leisure was what produced your sense of social solidarity, your sense of reciprocity, and most fundamentally, your sense of empathy. And that's why the Greeks gave great respect to the need to participate in the theater, in the arts, because the arts taught you empathy and provided your humanity. Now, if you flash forward from that conceptualization to the founding father of modern economics, Adam Smith, he dismissed all the activities that the vast majority of us in this room do as unproductive. Unproductive. Immanuel Kant, the same way of thinking, said all of these things that we do, services, are unworthy of citizenship. Then you flash to the 20th century, where laborism has grown. And you ask yourself, how stupid can you be? And you give an example. If I hire a housekeeper or a cook, national income goes up. Economic growth goes up. The precious jobs go up. The unemployment rate goes down. Wow. If I marry her, I have the privilege, and she continues to do precisely the same work, national income goes down, employment goes down, economic growth goes down, Ian Duncan Smith has a heart attack, which is the only good thing I can think, and unemployment rate goes up. Now, you can't get more sexist or stupid than that. But that is what the rhetoric of the politicians regards as work. That's what textbooks regard as work. That's what our labor statistics regard as work. We have no statistics on the work we do in society. And one of the contentions in the two books on the Precariat is that contrary to the claims of those who believe in technological unemployment, we have more jobs now than at any time in history. We have more work that people are required to do than at any time in my lifetime and in many other lifetimes. And the conceptualization of what we do with our time has to be profoundly changed. There's a beautiful saying that's come down to us from Cato. Never is a man more active than when he does nothing. And that idea of urgia, of laziness, was regarded by the ancient Greeks as an essential attribute of being a human being. To be lazy was a necessity if you were to develop your personality and your humanity. Today, if you listen to the politicians, you'd think being lazy was one of the biggest sins in life. What a transformation in thinking about time. The second contextual remark I want to make is that we are in the midst of what Karl Polanyi called in a previous era a global transformation. Karl Polanyi's great transformation was about the painful construction of national market systems. The first disembedded phase in the 19th century was dominated by financial capital, by banks and the bankers, and the insecurities and the inequalities multiplied as the pursuit of free markets continued until, in his words, there was a threat of the annihilation of civilization. Being an optimist and writing in 1943, his book came out in 1944, he saw a double movement, a re-embedding of the economy in society with new regulations, new systems of social protection, and new systems of redistribution. But, to cut a long story short, I won't go into that, that great transformation collapsed by about 1980, and we had the onset of a global transformation. And all our thinking of the future must be based on the understanding that we're essentially in the middle point of the global transformation, which is about the painful construction of a global market system. The disembedded phase that went from 1980 until now has been dominated by neoliberalism, financial capitalism. And to understand neoliberalism and what we have to confront, you have to realize it's not just about liberalizing markets, commodifying everything that can be commodified, individualizing, and so on, but the systematic dismantling of all institutions of social solidarity. All institutions that give empathy and reciprocity and that stand as barriers against the market. Now, among the immediate outcomes was the fact that, historically speaking, the world's labor supply quadrupled. That meant an extra 2 billion people have come onto the globalizing labor market. You don't have to have a Ph.D. in economics to realize that that's going to put huge downward pressure on wages, especially as productivity is rising very sharply in those emerging market economies. But in addition, we've had the strange thing which relates to what Paul was talking about. We have the emergence of rentier capitalism, in which intellectual property has been captured by the rentiers who've built an architecture, a global architecture, to enable huge growth in rental income going to a tiny minority. Patents, which were relatively minor in the previous era, have tripled per year in the last decade. Trillions of dollars go to the holders of patents. Each and every one patent holder has a guaranteed monopoly income flow of 20 years. That's information capture. Information isn't allowed to us, it's captured. The global corporations are patent hoovers. They hoover up patents. If you've got a patent, they'll buy it for you. You'll make a lot of money, but for them, it's worth billions. Copyright. Copyright now has multiplied out of all proportion, and a copyright gives people holding a copyright an income flow, monopoly flow, for 50 years after your death. I don't know what you're going to do with it, but you get it. Now, this is a profoundly different system, because what we see around the world in every country is the rising share of income going to profits, and an even sharply more rising share going to rent income, and a declining share going to wages. That is the context. So the future, I predict, is that although we'll have little fluctuations just before elections or whatever, real wages in our societies will continue to stagnate as they have done over the last 30 years, and in many cases will fall. That's the contextual reality. In the process, and this is the thesis that I put forward in the books, we've got a global class fragmentation that is taking place. A plutocracy that I don't need to describe, disgusting people. An elite below them, all making money from rent, various forms of rent. A salariat with their salaried jobs and pensions and all things like that. A group of what I call proficients, people who don't want long-term employment. They're making a lot of money. They're working very hard. They include some artists. Their only problem is burnout at approximately 27. Below them, the old proletariat, and I think Jeremy Corbyn, in a sense, is trying to resurrect the spirit of the proletariat. But as I've said to his advisors, he should look to the precariat rather than backwards. The proletariat is shrinking everywhere. Below that is the growing precariat, which I'll describe briefly. Below the precariat, out there in the streets, in every town and city of every country, there are millions of people who are in the lumpen precariat, waiting to die, hoping you will drop a few pennies or whatever into whatever they're holding out. The precariat is not an underclass, but it's the most rapidly growing group in society. It's every country has its precariat. Since my books were published, they've been translated into 15 languages, and I don't know how many copies have been sold. But it's something that resonates with people in Japan, in Korea, in the United States, in Austria, where I was last week, in Sweden, in Italy, in Greece. It's something that is global in character. I get thousands of emails from people who want to tell me their story about being in the precariat. What is it? Well, the group in the precariat, first of all, has distinctive relations of production. They are being habituated to accept and internalize a life of unstable labor and unstable living. All these new forms of labor and work that are proliferating. The latest one is crowd labor and the so-called sharing economy, where rentier brokers are putting out taskers. The latest wheeze is the Dutch auction situation, which is growing incredibly quickly, whereby people are contracted to do tasks online and bid against each other before they get the final contract. So they may declare on Monday, we're going to ask for so many jobs to be done. What bids do we get? We close the bidding on Friday lunchtime, and the bids may come in from Goa, from Manila, from Boston, from Brighton, wherever, and start at £20 and end up at £2. That is predicted to become one of the most important forms of labour transaction. But the second point and the third are more important in my view. The second point is that people in the precariat have no occupational identity, no occupational narrative that they can give to their lives. I am becoming something. I am something. And to my grandchildren, I was something. If you're in the precariat, you don't think like that. And strangely enough, the next thing is really important, and I feel that artistically it is something that needs to be captured more than it has been so far, which is that people in the precariat have to do a hell of a lot of work for labour that doesn't get counted as labour. They have to work in networking. They have to work in retraining because the last lot of retraining has become obsolescent before they could put it into practice. The Financial Times recently said that everybody should spend 15% of their time every year retraining. That's up here. If you're down here, it's more like 30%. Not only do you have to do all that networking and retraining and so on, you have to spend an incredible amount of time applying for jobs. I saw a beautiful concept recently, which I immediately borrowed and would like to claim to be my own, except it isn't: repetitive application syndrome. It turns out that thousands of people, and many seem to have written to me, expressing their anger and frustration, have to spend a huge amount of time applying to thousands of potential employers before they get one interview. The data to show that. Think how much time you're using. To say this isn't work is a bad joke, because they don't want to do it, but they have to do it. And algorithms mean that it is dirt cheap for the employers or potential employers to just require them to keep doing it. No cost to them. We also see that the precariat is increasingly required to do a hell of a lot of work for the state. Filling in forms, filling in meal forms, going in queues, finding you've got the wrong papers, finding that you use the wrong tone with a bureaucrat when you've been standing 2 hours in the queue in the rain. Oh, come back the next day, you nasty person. Come back the next day and you may get put at the end of the queue again. This is happening to millions of people around Europe. It's a reality that's meaning that they have to spend a lot of time doing work that isn't remunerated or rewarding in any way. But this leads to what I think is a crunch point about the precariat at the moment, because it's an existence of what economists call unbounded rationality. It's a fancy term, but basically it means you don't know what to do is the best thing with your time. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I network? Should I ring Jim? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I retrain? And as a consequence, you suffer from the precariatized mind, a feeling of being out of control in your own life. I recently was reading of a 26-year-old who committed suicide quite near here precisely because he was in that state of mind. It's causing a lot of social illness. And of course, in the circumstances of the precariatized mind, what activities lose out? The activity that loses out most fundamentally, I believe, is leisure in the Greek sense. The ability to participate in the arts, the creativity, the real leisure. You're too stressed out from all that tension, so you just watch football matches and drink beer or whatever it is that keeps you sedated. But real participation in society is what suffers. The next aspect, and a remarkable one, is that this is the first working class in history whose modal level of education is above the level of labor they can expect to obtain. Think of the status frustration. Think of the angst that that causes. Think of the corrosion that that must take. The second way of looking at the precariat is it has distinctive relations of distribution. A Marxian term, but you don't have to be a Marxist to understand it. It is the only class that has to rely almost entirely on money wages. It does not get those non-wage benefits that people in salaried jobs get, paid holidays, paid medical assurance, paid bonding trips to golf clubs, etc. Doesn't get any of that. Surprise, surprise. But it also doesn't get access to rights-based state benefits. Increasingly, governments have turned to means testing, and with that, automatically to behavior testing, creating incredible poverty traps. At the moment, in this country, the marginal tax that someone in the precariat pays in going from reliance on benefits, which are falling and harder to get, to taking a low-wage job, which wages are falling, is worked out to be over 80%. In Germany, the government's calculated it is currently 86%, in Denmark, 84%. In other words, the tax rate that people on the margins are paying is twice as much as any group higher up the income scale, and 3 times the rate than anybody up there in the plutocracy and the elite. What a wonderful system. Could not be more regressive. But you also have what I call a precarity trap. The precarity trap arises in the following way. If you lose a low-wage job, do you think you start receiving benefits tomorrow morning? If so, you're an idiot. You have to fill in forms, you have to queue, you have to apply, the checks. And it turns out that millions across Europe, not just this country, have to wait not days, not weeks, but months before they start receiving a meager benefit. And then a young, spotty-faced person who's also in the precariat, just come out of school, who's employed in the DWP or wherever, says, we have found a casual job the other side of Brighton, you've got to take it. It'll only last 3 weeks, probably. Now, is there anybody in this room who thinks it would be rational for such a person to take such a job? Given the 80% marginal tax rate, he's only getting 20% extra, in other words, you'd be crazy to say it's rational. Because very quickly you would be losing that job and then have to start queuing all over again to try and get access to these means-tested benefits that Ian Duncan Smith and his wonderful colleagues are tightening up all the time. Now, the third aspect and final one is very dramatic because the precariat has distinctive relations to the state. And what that means is that this is the first class in history which is in the process of losing rights of citizenship, losing cultural rights, losing civil rights, losing social rights, losing political rights, and losing economic rights. I document that in the new book, but this is unprecedented historically. And ultimately, and this is what I think is the worst feature of being in the precariat, people who are in the precariat are supplicants. They're beggars. They have to ask for favor. They have to satisfy in some way, behaviorally or otherwise. They have to rely on charity. They have to rely on your goodwill or on the bad will of the bureaucracies. This is the worst aspect. But there's a good story. Because the precariat are not just victims. At the moment, they're a class in the making, And although they're at war with themselves in the sense that part of it are atavists falling out of working class communities who look to the past and become neo-fascist very quickly, and the migrants are nostalgics and they stay out of politics, the young, educated part of the precariat are looking for a new politics of paradise, a new progressive politics. And this, I think, is where we need to come back to Karl Polanyi's essential model. Because for a transformation to move into that double movement, three principles have to be accepted. The first principle is that the forward march towards more freedom, towards more equality, and to more fraternity and solidarity is always led by the interests and aspirations of the emerging mass class, not yesterday's mass class. The second principle is that every new forward march involves new forms of collective action on behalf of those values. And the third principle is that every new forward march, progressive politics, involves three overlapping struggles. The first struggle is a struggle for recognition, a struggle to go from a failure and someone with deficiencies who's useless and alone to being able to look in the mirror and say, hey, I'm part of a class. There are millions out there just like me with my features. And having that recognition means I can go out with my head held high and say, it's not my fault. It's the fault of the structures around me. And in doing so, immediately one starts to gain a sense of agency, as the sociologists say. Now, one minor point, very minor, Paul, where I've disagreed with Paul on one comment he made, which is not today, but before, which we've had hundreds of protests since 2008, 2011 in particular. Hundreds. I've participated in a few myself, and he said they've all been failures. On the contrary, all over the world, these protests have been helping to forge an identity, forge a sense of collective action, of subjectivity. And they are, first and foremost, the actions of primitive rebels. A primitive rebel is like Robin Hood. He knows what he's against, but he doesn't necessarily know what he's for. But in coming together and protesting, a new identity has been accelerated. And consequently, we've had new Precariat parties emerging in Spain with Podemos, in Greece with Syriza, in Poland with several big parties I think will have a good chance of winning the next general election, and in Sweden and various other places. So we have that. Now, the second, and very briefly, struggle is a struggle for representation. A struggle for the voice of the precariat to be in the state. Because unless we have representation in the state, they will be treated in the way that the Ian Duncan Smiths of the world would like them to be treated. Moralistically from on high by people who know that you and I are hardworking, they are skivers, or whatever the derogatory term you want to employ. Only with a sense of representation in the institutions of the state will the precariat be on the way to gaining effective power. And the third struggle is a struggle for redistribution. But a redistribution of what? In our tertiary society of the 21st century, when the old income distribution system has broken down irretrievably. It wouldn't be the Marxist or the socialist or communist struggle of 100 years ago for the means of production. The means of production are in our pockets over our shoulders or whatever. It will be a struggle for the redistribution of the key assets of a tertiary society, where the precariat are the most deprived. These are security, quality time, quality space, knowledge, and financial capital. A progressive strategy has to have a strategy for redistributing all of those because they are more unequally distributed at the moment than income itself. If you're in the salariat or up here, you have total security. You can buy expertise, you deal with your hazards and problems. If you're down in the precariat, one little accident, you're out in the street, you're homeless, your debts spiral out of control. The difference is enormous. Now, with that perspective, I was communicating with a very famous American intellectual who's endorsed the book very kindly. And I said, look, this was last year, I said, next year, 2015, is the 800th anniversary of the founding document that became the Magna Carta in 1217. And what if we were to think of a charter for the precariat in 2015 for the 21st century? Now, you need a few drinks to do something like that. You need some good sex, and probably a lot of good sex, in order to have the courage or whatever it takes to do it. But I've come up with a charter of 29 demands, which include low-hanging fruit, in other words, could be done fairly easily, and high-hanging fruit that we have to struggle for and really make a lot of noise if we're going to get there. And one of those, probably among the highest of the fruit, is what I would like to end my comments on. And that is, I've been working and doing research on a basic income for several decades, let's leave it at that. And we formed an international network called BIEN, that was mentioned earlier. And I'm very proud that we've got Barb Jacobson here, who is the head of the UK network. And I urge all of you, if you're interested, to join both BIEN and the British network, promoting debate, discussion, and improving our lobbying capabilities. A basic income is needed to give security to the most insecure groups in our society. It's a matter of social justice, not just poverty eradication. The example I give is Thomas Paine and C.G.H. Cole both had similar ideas. And basically the idea is that the wealth and income of all of us is far more to do with the efforts and endeavors of our forefathers and foremothers than anything you or I can do. But you and I do not know who made the contribution to your wealth and my wealth. So in a sense, having a basic income where everybody has a modest basic income could be seen as a social dividend on the collective wealth created by our ancestors. And I came up with that idea when I was asked to talk about the Precariat and Middlesbrough. Middlesbrough, as you may know, in 1820 was a little village, and then they discovered iron ore. By the 1830s, Middlesbrough and Teesside around it had become the hub of the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire. Sydney Harbour Bridge, built with iron ore from Middlesbrough. Golden Gate Bridge in California, built with the iron ore from Middlesbrough. If you go to Middlesbrough today, you see houses blocked up with concrete, pocket handkerchief gardens full of weeds, people hanging around on street corners, very much in the precariat, without any hope. Down in the south of England, not necessarily in Brighton, but quite close here, you have the descendants of those who made the money out of all the work done in Middlesbrough. And they are back in government with their Eton and Oxbridge education to give them the power that they still have. If you look at a Middlesbrough, you say, there must be justice and a basic income could help. It's not a panacea. The objections, which I review in the book, are familiar. The first one being that it's unaffordable. Unaffordable? When the banks crashed in 2008, somehow the Bank of England and the government found £375 billion to give to the bankers who'd caused the crash. Today, their bonuses and incomes are up in the stratosphere. Austerity has hit the Precariat very, very hard. If you can afford to give the financial community 375 billion, and in the European Central Bank's case give out 1,000 billion, then please shut up when you say it's unaffordable to give people a modest basic income. But there are many ways of affording it: setting up a sovereign wealth fund, cutting subsidies that are paid to corporations, and so on. That argument is terrible. The second classic, and I'm not going to have time because it's flashing at me, is that it reduces labor supply and makes people lazy. Well, our pilots in India and Africa and in Brazil have shown that when people get a basic income, they work more, not less. And when they work, they're more productive, not less. And when they work, they're more cooperative, not less. Psychological experiments have done the same. And when people have a basic income, they're more tolerant to strangers, they're more altruistic in their behavior. And in the end, as the theme of the book on basic income shows with hard evidence, people who have a basic income and it's a community thing, they pool their money to improve the community and become more cooperative in developing their work and their leisure, becoming more like citizens within their community. For me, basic income is not a panacea. Many other policies are needed, but it certainly is the most vital income distribution policies we need today. Thank you very much.